Hello, everyone. My name is Cynthia Cruz, and I am the Business Relations Specialist for the Southwest region of Ohio. I'd like to welcome you to the final session in the Employer's ADA Handbook webinar series, which is the Accessibility Hour. Accessibility Hour makes me think of 60 Minutes, and I am not Morley Safer or Leslie Stahl. So instead of Andy Rooney, I am happy to be co-hosting with my colleague, Julie Wood. Julie, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about today's presentation?
Yes, thank you, Cynthia. Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Wood, and I am the Worksite Accessibility Specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. I am also an occupational therapist and an ADA coordinator. As Cynthia mentioned, today we are delivering the final webinar in our 5-part series on Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we refer to as the ADA. And just to recap, our first session addressed the main responsibilities employers have under Title I. Session 2 discussed best practices for providing reasonable accommodations. Session 3 included information on how to navigate performance, conduct, and safety when disability is involved. And Session 4 described the many resources available to employers to help them meet their obligations and create inclusive workplaces. Our goal with today's Accessibility Hour is to answer some of the frequently asked questions we receive about Title I, and so we will discuss a variety of topics, many of which have been addressed throughout the webinar series and some that have not.
Thank you, Julie. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training does come with PowerPoint slides, a learner's guide, and a helpful fact sheet. You can access these resources through the link that's posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice. But we do hope the information is helpful for you. We will be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and once more right before we conclude to answer questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time so they're ready for us when we stop. And now you know the rest of the story. Okay, so today we are addressing the questions employers frequently have when it comes to navigating Title I of the ADA. Julie, would you like to share what topics we are covering?
Sure. We organized the questions we received into 4 main topics, including guidance on Title I of the ADA, reasonable accommodations, funding, and common scenarios. So we are going to take these topics one at a time and address some of the questions we received. To address those we do not have time to cover, we did include additional content in the learner's guide.
Great, Julie. So let's begin with Title I of the ADA and a quick review of its purpose in the workplace.
Sure. So the ADA has 5 titles. Title I prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all aspects of employment, and it requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified applicants and employees with disabilities when one is needed, unless doing so causes an undue hardship.
Well, how do employers know what the responsibilities are under Title I, and where can they find guidance on these responsibilities?
Title I is regulated and enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is known as the EEOC. And the EEOC has published guidance to assist employers in understanding their responsibilities under Title I. In the Learner's Guide, we've provided websites that list some of the more commonly referenced guidance for employers. For example, we included a link to the website with information on COVID-19 and the ADA. We included the EEOC website that organizes guidance by subject area. We listed the guidance we used for this training in the resource section. And we listed other websites that include an ADA library of resources, such as from the Job Accommodation Network, which is known as JAN, and from some of the ADA centers. So the collection of resources in the Learner's Guide will hopefully make it easy to find the information you're looking for when you need it.
Well, we may not have had 50 plus seasons like 60 Minutes to glean that info, but it sounds like we still have a wealth of information to share. So let's begin with our first frequently asked question about Title I. When should an individual with a disability disclose their disability?
Cynthia, disclosure is a popular topic and it can come with some confusion. So first and foremost, individuals with disabilities are not required to disclose their disability ever. And it's always the choice of the individual to decide whether to do so. For some individuals, deciding to disclose a disability can be a difficult decision. And there are reasons individuals choose to disclose and reasons individuals choose not to disclose.
So why might an individual choose not to disclose their disability, Julie?
Well, individuals may fear being viewed negatively by others, or being questioned that their disability is real, or of being accused of trying to obtain special privileges.
Okay. Well, you also said there are reasons that an individual may choose to disclose their disability.
Yes, some individuals have reported that disclosing their disability has helped them to develop a support system, or it has relieved the stress associated with not disclosing their disability. And one big reason individuals choose to disclose their disability is to receive protection under Title I for a reasonable accommodation at work. Now, we know a reasonable accommodation may be requested at any point in the hiring process or during employment. So it's important to remember that individuals can choose if and when to disclose their disability, and they do not have to disclose at any certain time.
Aha. Great. So now this next question has come up a few times during our webinars. Julie, what conditions are considered disabilities under the ADA?
The ADA defines disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And the EEOC does provide examples of what major life activities are and the criteria for determining a substantial limitation. We addressed these topics in the first session of the employer's ADA handbook, which focused on an overview of Title I. So there isn't a list of diseases, diagnoses, or conditions that automatically qualify as a disability. Now, there are certain conditions which should be easily concluded to be a disability. For example, deafness, blindness, diabetes, and major depressive disorder. The entire list of these conditions from the ADA National Network is included in the Learner's Guide. In other cases, some conditions may result in a substantial limitation for some and not others. And so determining whether the limitation rises to the level of a disability will be unique to each individual and must be based on a case-by-case analysis.
So, hey, Julie, can you give us an example of a condition that might result in a disability for one person and maybe not for another?
Yes, I have an example from Jan about the condition of a back injury. So one person works as a receptionist and has a back injury which results in pain that restricts the ability to walk, sit, and stand. This person was found by a court to have a disability. Another person works as a general laborer and has a back injury and continued to be able to perform his daily activities, including his work activities. In fact, this person shifted careers from a laborer to a security guard. So the court determined this person was not substantially limited in any major life activity and so was not found to have a disability.
All right, thank you, Julie. Okay, next question is, who do I contact for ADA services? And I know that you're a resource for our employer partners, Julie, and you also know of other helpful resources. So like 60 Minutes, the longest running, most watched news program, it sounds like these resources are must-see TV.
Absolutely, Cynthia. I offer worksite accessibility services at no cost, which include consulting with our employer partners when they have questions about making their work environments accessible, removing workplace barriers, identifying possible reasonable accommodations, and identifying best practices for navigating Title I of the ADA. So I am happy to be your first point of contact when you have questions. There are also other great resources which offer best practices and guidance. The ADA National Network is a great resource for all 5 titles of the ADA, including Title I. The network has 10 regional centers, and they all offer technical assistance, training, and publications to educate on the ADA. Ohio is in the Great Lakes region, so that's the center we would reach out to with questions. The Northeast ADA Center created a Small Business at Work toolkit, and this offers resources and practical advice for following Title I when hiring and retaining qualified employees with disabilities. There is also the Job Accommodation Network, which is known as JAN, which offers many resources for workplace accommodations and for disability employment issues. Specifically, JAN offers a resource called the A to Z of Disabilities and Accommodations, which organizes topics by disability, limitation, work-related function, and accommodation, so it's easy to find the information you're looking for. JAN also has a workplace accommodation toolkit, which includes information for creating disability inclusive workplaces, and it offers examples of accommodation policies and accommodation forms. And finally, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has a Small Business Resource Center, which provides information on Title I through fact sheets and videos. And the EEOC also offers training and consultations through its small business liaisons.
There certainly were many hours of research into resources to reach out to regarding Title I, and we've included these resources in the Learner's Guide. So now let's shift to the topic of reasonable accommodations.
Cynthia, Title I of the ADA requires covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations unless doing so cause an undue hardship. And just as a reminder, a reasonable accommodation is a change in the workplace or a work process that enables an individual with a disability to access the hiring process, perform the job, and enjoy the privileges of employment. Sometimes fulfilling this obligation comes with some questions from employers.
Julie, you are correct. We did receive several questions on this topic, and I believe they may share the same answer. The first is, are employers required to create a formal process for providing reasonable accommodations? The second is, what is the best way to navigate the ADA process with an employee? And the final two combined asked, what are best practices for providing Title I reasonable accommodations, including identifying and implementing effective solutions?
Well, Cynthia, the answer to the first question is no. The ADA does not require employers to create a formal process or develop procedures to provide reasonable accommodations. What the EEOC guidance states is this: a request for reasonable accommodation is the first step in an informal interactive process between the individual and the employer. However, creating a formal process is a best practice because it helps to make sure requests for accommodations are received and acted upon quickly and effectively. So when you ask what the best way is to navigate the process with an employee, the answer is to establish a formal process for handling requests and then follow the plan effectively.
Well, that's simple enough. For employers who want to create or enhance a process, we do have 2 resources to share, both of which identify the steps to take in the process and include best practices and examples. The first is a resource on the JAN website, and it's called the Interactive Process. The second resource is the webinar that we created called Navigating the Reasonable Accommodation Process, which is available on demand on our website under our employer pages. Hey, Julie, can you take a second to quickly share some information about the main steps in the process?
Of course. When an applicant or an employee communicates a hiring or a work-related problem and attributes this to a medical condition, the employer should treat this as a request for an accommodation and begin the interactive process immediately. The first step then is to obtain the information you need to process the request. This is when you may determine you want to ask for documentation if the disability or the need for the accommodation are not obvious. And remember, the process is intended to be an interactive collaboration between you and the individual to clarify what is needed, which is always determined on a case-by-case basis because each person, job, and employer is unique. As you collaborate, you will identify possible solutions together. Now, the best place to start is to ask the employee what he or she thinks might be helpful. The employee may have experienced this barrier before and already knows what solution would be effective. When the employee and the employer do not know what the effective solution is, there are outside sources that can help. First, you could ask the employee's medical provider for ideas or to comment on an accommodation you are considering. You just want to make sure to get the employee's permission before you reach out to their medical provider. You could mention our vocational rehabilitation services here at OOD to the employee during your interactive process. These services are free and confidential and can help to identify what the individual needs to be successful on the job. You can also consult with Jan about ideas for workplace accommodations. Once you identify a possible solution, but you're not sure if it will be successful, you may consider implementing a trial period to see if the accommodation is effective. In this case, it's a good idea to create a written agreement that indicates the accommodation is being tested, states how long the trial will last, and describes what will happen if the accommodation isn't effective. Once you've identified an effective, reasonable accommodation, it can help to create a plan to make sure the solution is implemented successfully. Some accommodations require installation and training, as well as maintaining software updates. So it's important to plan for how these steps will be completed successfully. And because we know things can change, it's very important to periodically monitor accommodations for effectiveness. So encourage the employee to notify you if the accommodation stops being successful, and also inform the employee that you will be following up from time to time to check on the effectiveness of the accommodation.
I can see where having a formal process really does help to facilitate implementing reasonable accommodations. Okay, our next question is, how many reasonable accommodations become too many and become an undue hardship?
Cynthia, the ADA is very clear that the responsibility to provide reasonable accommodation for a qualified employee with a disability is an ongoing obligation, and each request must be considered on a case-by-case basis. There isn't a quantifiable answer to that question, meaning there is no number of reasonable accommodations that the ADA or the EEOC indicate is too many or create an undue hardship. And that is because what each employee with a disability needs is unique, and what each employer can provide as a reasonable accommodation is also unique. As we've said before, often employees with disabilities do not need reasonable accommodations to perform the job, but when an accommodation is needed, there are times an employee may need one accommodation while other employees may need more than one. There may be times when an employee who is receiving a reasonable accommodation experiences a change in the workplace or with the disability and needs another accommodation or a different one. It's also possible that an employee may only need a reasonable accommodation at certain times, such as when they are experiencing a flare-up of a condition. The ADA says an individual with a disability is entitled to accommodations that are reasonable and necessary for participating in a work-related activity. So an employer must consider each request for an accommodation on a case-by-case basis. That means if an employee with a disability needs more than one accommodation, each request must be considered by the employer. Now, the ADA also says an employer is not required to provide an accommodation that causes an undue hardship. We know that undue hardship must also be determined on a case-by-case basis through an individualized assessment using criteria from the EEOC, which we've referenced in the Learner's Guide. So the answer to the question is you take each request for an accommodation one at a time and make the individualized assessment of whether there is an accommodation that is reasonable and does not cause an undue hardship.
Thanks, Julie. Our next topic addresses setting a precedent. We had an employer state that my team sometimes has concerns that the reasonable accommodation is setting a precedent that we can't keep up with, much like my parents' grandfather clock.
Cynthia, I've heard this concern before that providing a reasonable accommodation for one employee will set a precedent for future requests for reasonable accommodations from individuals with disabilities and general requests for accommodations from all employees. So let me start with saying when an employer provides a reasonable accommodation for one employee with a disability, it is not necessarily required to provide the same reasonable accommodation for another employee with a disability. And this is because requests for reasonable accommodations are handled on a case-by-case basis through an individualized assessment of the specific facts of the current situation. An accommodation that is determined to be reasonable in one situation could be an undue hardship in another because the facts of each situation are unique. If you are receiving questions from employees about the reasonable accommodations they notice in the workplace and they're asking for the same accommodation, you may want to consider providing training for your supervisors on how to respond. And we will discuss this a bit later in the webinar.
Our next question is asking if you can provide resources and examples of reasonable accommodations for common scenarios, including COVID-19. We also received a question requesting a list of common assistive technologies.
I know I say this a lot, but it's worth repeating that reasonable accommodations are considered on a case-by-case basis through an individualized assessment because each person, job, and employer is unique. However, we are going to share some general examples of assistive technology and reasonable accommodations for common scenarios like driving, the COVID-19 environment, and for interviews.
Well, Julie, let's sundial that back and start with assistive technology. There are many items that could be used as a form of reasonable accommodation, but what examples do you have?
You are correct. There are many examples because assistive technology by definition is any item, piece of equipment, software program, or product system that is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of persons with disabilities. And so assistive technology can be high tech or low tech. It can come in the form of hardware or software, or it can be a device or an item. I do have some common examples we see used in the workplace. For an employee who is blind or has low vision, some of these items may include screen reading software, braille displays, and magnifiers. For an employee who is deaf or hard of hearing, examples may include a personal amplification system, phones with captioning, and mobile devices with texting or other speech-to-text applications. And for the computer workstation, we have seen options like alternative keyboards and mice, adjustable height workstations, and speech recognition software.
Those are some great examples of assistive technology, Julie. All right, well, our time is ticking away. So before we discuss additional examples for reasonable accommodations, let's take our first break to see what questions have come in. All right. Julie, is there a preferred time that an individual with a disability should disclose their disability at work and request a reasonable accommodation?
Well, we discussed earlier that it's the individual's choice whether to disclose their disability, and they're not required ever to do that. and that a person with a disability may request a reasonable accommodation at any point during the hiring process or with employment. So it's always up to the individual. The person can choose to do if and when to do this if and when they wish, but there are some moments that might be more preferred. So really, anytime an individual with a disability notices a barrier to applying for a job, participating in an interview, it's a good time to go ahead and mention that barrier and request an accommodation so that that process can become accessible for the person to compete for the job. And also another good time to disclose a disability and request an accommodation would be when an individual notices a barrier to performing an essential function of the job before a productivity issue really arises. So that can be addressed as soon as possible.
All right, thanks, Julie. Also, do remember, if you have questions, please remember to ask them in the Q&A box here. We will take one more break a little bit later in the presentation to answer any other questions that have come in. So thank you for that question, but tempus fugit, time flies when you're having fun. So let's discuss some examples of reasonable accommodations in the workplace and start with driving and work. There are a few driving categories an employee might request an accommodation for, such as commuting to work, traveling to other locations as a part of their workday, or working as a professional driver, something nobody has ever asked me to do. And there are a variety of disability-related limitations that may require the need for an accommodation, such as a low back condition that limits prolonged sitting, a sudden injury that results in paralysis of the legs, or a seizure disorder that results in a temporary driving restriction. What ideas do you have for accommodations, Julie?
Cynthia, I have some examples from Jan for each of the categories you mentioned. So for commuting to work, there may be times an employee's disability limits the ability to drive, and so the person uses public transportation, such as a city bus. And the bus's schedule causes the employee to arrive to work late. So one idea for an accommodation is to permit a flexible schedule so the employee can adjust their start time according to their arrival time through public transportation. The second category was traveling to other locations as a part of the employee's workday. There may be times an employee's ability to drive is suddenly limited by a condition, such as a back condition. And so if it's reasonable, the employer could consider as a form of accommodation that the time the employee spends driving be limited in duration or distance. Another idea is to determine if the purpose of traveling to other locations can be accomplished through a video call instead of an in-person meeting. And the third category was working as a professional driver. Let's say an employee has diabetes, which results in an amputation of the lower right leg and alters the ability to drive. One consideration for an accommodation would be to modify the vehicle used for work-related driving.
Well, those are some helpful ideas, Julie. With an up-to-the-minute topic, what about reasonable accommodations related to COVID-19?
Cynthia, employers may receive requests for accommodations from employees who are experiencing the long-term effects associated with COVID-19. So just as a reminder about what we discussed before, there is no list of conditions that automatically qualify as a disability under the ADA. And so the employer will still undergo the same process to determine if a disability exists as they would with any request for an accommodation. With that said, there are some long-term limitations that have been associated with COVID-19, and Jan created a resource with ideas for accommodations for these limitations. So I'll share a few of these now. One limitation includes shortness of breath with exertion, and some possible accommodations for this may include permitting a modified break schedule so the employee can manage any treatments they are prescribed, such as using an inhaler. Or another accommodation could be to restructure the job to remove or swap any marginal functions that may cause more exertion. Another limitation is extreme fatigue. So one idea is to offer a flexible schedule that permits the employee to work during the hours they feel most rested and have their best energy. Or you may consider providing ergonomic equipment to decrease the physical effort of performing work tasks. Some individuals experience brain fog, and so providing uninterrupted time to work on tasks and providing noise canceling devices may help to increase the employee's focus for work. And one last limitation I'll share includes having headaches. And so when this is the case, adjusting the lighting and glare in the work area could be helpful, or permitting the employee to telework to avoid work-related triggers.
Julie, a question we do receive frequently is about what accommodations are available to an employee who operates heavy equipment like a forklift. So when he or she is deaf or hard of hearing, what ideas do you have for that?
The ideas I have come from Jan and also the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which we know as OSHA. The first idea is to designate separate paths of travel for your pedestrians and for heavy equipment, and then mark each of these paths visually, either with tape or paint, rope, or signs. You could also designate separate doors for pedestrians and heavy equipment. Another idea is to require operators of heavy equipment to stop at all intersections. You could consider installing sensor warning lights on heavy equipment that blink as the vehicle is approaching. Another idea is to install mirrors at all intersections to alert pedestrians to oncoming traffic. And you could use alerting devices such as a pager that vibrates, so the operator of heavy equipment can alert an employee with a hearing disability of an approaching vehicle. And while these are good possibilities for accommodations, they're also really good ideas in general for keeping all of your employees safe at work.
Julie, those ideas are helpful and they seem easy enough to implement. We, of course, want to be better than the broken clock that's only correct twice a day. So the last accommodation you wanted to discuss is about requests for sign language interpretation for interviews.
Yes, we have had employers ask about the responsibility to provide accommodations for the interview process, specifically for sign language interpretation. So as a reminder, covered employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations for qualified applicants with disabilities when one is needed to compete for a job. Of course, unless doing so causes an undue hardship. So when an applicant requests a sign language interpreter for the interview, this is a request for a reasonable accommodation, and the employer should begin the interactive process right away. Jan has a resource called Finding an Interpreter for an Interview, and it explains that it may be necessary to obtain an interpreter for the interview because often that is what is effective to enable the applicant and the interviewer to communicate fully, so the applicant can be effectively evaluated for the job. What can be helpful for employers is to identify local and national providers for American Sign Language interpreters in advance. That way you're prepared when you receive a request. And when you're determining whether this accommodation is reasonable, remember to consider tax benefits you are eligible for, because your assessment should be determined on the net cost of the accommodation after you apply any outside funding sources you're eligible for, such as the Disabled Access Credit, which is available for small businesses.
That's a perfect example of how a tax benefit can help an employer provide a reasonable accommodation like sign language interpretation. Now, in the past year, we've reset the clock on what workspaces can look like. We have a question about telework. What is an employer's obligation to provide telework as an accommodation after returning employees to on-site work who were teleworking during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Cynthia, telework has been a type of reasonable accommodation employers could consider even before the pandemic. But as we know, due to the pandemic, many employers shifted their employees to a remote work environment, and now some employers are bringing employees back to the workplace. So at any point, whether it's during a pandemic or after, when an employer receives a request for telework as a reasonable accommodation, They should treat this request the same as any request for an accommodation and promptly begin the interactive process. If the employee needs to work remotely due to a disability and can perform the essential functions of the job, the employer should consider whether telework is an effective, reasonable accommodation. Now, prior to the pandemic, some employers may have believed a job's essential functions could not be performed effectively through telework. But this temporary shift to working remotely may have demonstrated that the job's essential functions can be performed effectively through telework. And so this temporary shift kind of served as a trial period for showing work can be performed successfully from home. Employers do have the right to explore all effective options and choose which solution to implement. However, the EEOC guidance does encourage employers to consider the employee's preference as long as the accommodation is reasonable and effective. We did include some resources from the EEOC and from JAN in the Learner's Guide, which addresses telework as a reasonable accommodation, and some of these specifically address the pandemic.
Thank you, Julie. Next question is, how long should you give an employee to show the accommodations provided are adequate?
Well, Cynthia, the ADA does not state how long you should give an accommodation before you determine whether it's effective. But as we discussed earlier, the ADA does emphasize that the obligation to provide reasonable accommodations is an ongoing responsibility. During those times when you're not sure if an accommodation will be successful and you decide to implement it under a trial period like we discussed, you can indicate in the trial's written agreement how long the trial is expected to last, and that will be unique to each situation. So you and the employee will work together to determine what is a reasonable amount of time to try the accommodation and determine if it's effective. Some items might be effective immediately, such as implementing an adjustable height workstation, but other items might require a learning curve, such as using speech-to-text software. So the time it takes to evaluate these two accommodations for effectiveness is likely different. And just as each request for an accommodation is unique and should be determined on a case-by-case basis, the same is true for determining the length of time a trial period should last.
So the case-by-case assessment is key to many of these scenarios under Title I. Next question is asking if we have any guidance on mental health accommodations.
Well, when an employer receives a request, they begin the interactive process. And if the disability or the need for the accommodation are not obvious, which they may not be with a mental health disability, the employer would be permitted to obtain documentation if they choose. As far as determining the effective solution, the employer would follow the same case-by-case assessment they do with all requests to determine the effective solution. What can be helpful is understanding the type of accommodations that might be needed when an employee has a mental health disability, such as modifying a policy, providing equipment, making a change to the built environment, or altering a supervisory method. So I'll share some examples of these. One accommodation idea may be to permit a flexible schedule to enable an employee to leave work early 1 day per week to attend a therapy session. Another idea could be to modify a break schedule to enable an employee to take breaks when they need to for participating in breathing exercises, which promote relaxation and focus for work tasks. Another accommodation could be to install partitions in the work area to create a visual barrier, which could help an employee working in a high traffic area to block out that distraction and focus on work. Or for noisy environments, the solution may be to provide noise canceling headphones to enable an employee to concentrate on their work tasks. Another accommodation idea could be to modify a training policy to permit a job coach to work with an employee during the onboarding process and for training for a new position. And one final example may be to alter how a supervisor communicates information. For example, a supervisor could follow up an in-person meeting with written communications that are sent through email so the employee can reference these another time if the employee possibly has a limitation with memory. There are resources in the Learner's Guide that include additional information from the ADA National Network and the EEOC, as well as our on-demand webinar called Mental Health Disabilities in the Workplace, which is archived on our website.
Thanks, Julie. Along with the previous question, we also received this one. What job accommodations and job coach interventions are available for individuals with autism spectrum disorder and mental illness?
Well, we just discussed mental health accommodations, so I'll focus on accommodations related to autism and discuss job coaching. When an employee with autism needs an accommodation, identifying the effective solution is always a case-by-case process, just as it is with any request you receive. But I do have some examples of ideas. So sometimes the sensory stimuli in the work environment can be overwhelming to an employee with autism, and some ways to reduce or eliminate this include providing reasonable accommodations such as noise canceling headphones, altering lighting, providing a private office, or permitting a flexible break schedule so the person can take rest breaks away from the stimulating environment. Another accommodation may be in the form of restructuring how a job is performed by permitting the use of checklists and flow charts to help the employee manage their work tasks, and using reminder applications on smart devices to remember to start or end a task or return from a break. And a form of accommodation could be to alter a supervisory method, which could include the supervisor and the employee meeting more frequently to review daily work tasks. Another form of reasonable accommodation is to modify a training policy to permit a job coach to work with the employee. Job coaches are trained to customize their approach based on the individual's needs, and they can be provided on site in the workplace or work remotely through virtual platforms and applications on smart devices. The goal of job coaching is to enable an employee with a disability to learn a new job, perform the work tasks effectively and independently, and adapt to a new work environment. So when it's needed, it's a great form of reasonable accommodation.
We have included resources and guidance on job coaching from Jan and the ADA National Network in the Learner's Guide, and also included our on-demand webinar called Job Developers and Job Coaches in the Workplace, which is archived on our website under the Employer Page tab. Okay, discussing reasonable accommodations usually leads to questions about costs. So let's shift now to the topic of funding. Discussing reasonable accommodations do affect funding.
Cynthia, according to the Northeast ADA Center, the Small Business at Work Toolkit, one of the top 5 reported concerns of providing reasonable accommodations is the cost of the accommodation. So let me repeat what I know I've said in many other webinars. Often employees with disabilities do not need accommodations at work. However, when one is needed, a survey from Jan revealed 56% of accommodations were free. And of those that required a one-time cost, the typical cost was $500. So based on these studies, accommodations are often reasonable. We know under Title I, covered employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations unless doing so causes an undue hardship. An undue hardship means an accommodation is too costly or too difficult to implement, and making this determination requires an individualized assessment of the current situation. So in this section, we are going to address some of the questions we receive about funding of reasonable accommodations.
Well, that's great to know, Julie. So let's start with that first question. What tax benefits are available for employers to help pay for reasonable accommodations?
When an employer is assessing the cost of an accommodation, Congress intended for employers to consider their net cost after applying funding sources or tax benefits they are eligible to receive. We discussed funding options in the 4th session of our Employers ADA Handbook, which focused on resources and funding. So we will just talk briefly about the tax benefits now. The first is the Disabled Access Credit, which applies to small businesses and it covers most expenses a business may incur when providing reasonable accommodations, like sign language interpreters, creating documents in Braille, and building ramps. There is also the barrier removal tax deduction, which applies to all businesses and covers the removal of barriers in the built environment and with transportation, such as widening doors and modifying vehicles. And there is the work opportunity tax credit, which applies to businesses of any size, and it encourages the employment of individuals from targeted groups, including individuals referred from vocational rehabilitation programs such as OOD.
Thank you for that quick summary, Julie. So there are some definite benefits when it comes to funding for reasonable accommodations. For those who would like more information, we've included links to these tax benefits in the Learner's Guide. Julie, our next question is, are there federal grants available to employers which will help provide financial assistance to the employer in purchasing costly equipment or technology for employee accommodations?
Cynthia, we are not aware of federal grants to help offset the cost of providing equipment or technology as accommodations for employees with disabilities. However, we are aware of some funding resources an employer could research further. The Assistive Technology Industry Association offers an AT Resources Funding Guide, which provides resources from organizations, insurance providers, federal and state programs, advocacy groups, scholarships, and grants. Also, Jan has an article on funding which provides tips for both employers and individuals.
Those are some helpful resources, and we have included both in the Learner's Guide, so you won't need an abacus to calculate your savings from those. Now we're going to talk about some of the common scenarios that employers experience.
Cynthia, we often receive questions from employers when they are navigating some common situations, such as creating an inclusive workplace, preparing for emergencies, and asking a landlord about providing reasonable accommodations. So in this section of the webinar, we are going to answer the frequently asked questions we received.
Let's start with an inclusive workplace. We received two questions that I think could be answered together. Number one, what is the best way to address discrimination and harassment against employees with disabilities from coworkers? And number two, when providing a reasonable accommodation causes issues with coworkers or results in hurt feelings of coworkers, how should an employer handle this?
Cynthia, one of the responsibilities covered employers have under Title I is to ensure employees with disabilities are not harassed or discriminated against based on disability. If an employer receives a complaint from an employee of harassment or discrimination, the EEOC guidance indicates the employer should respond promptly, conduct an appropriate investigation, and take corrective action when necessary. Of course, we all hope this is never the case, and one best practice to prevent discrimination and harassment is to be proactive. Guidance from the EEOC indicates that regular, interactive training tailored to the audience and the organization can be effective in preventing this type of treatment. In the Learner's Guide, we included some examples from the guidance of what content to include in this type of training for all employees. Employers may also consider making efforts to create a workplace culture that is disability inclusive to further prevent this kind of treatment and any issues of hurt feelings that may arise. One effective way to do this is through providing disability awareness training. And Cynthia, I know you deliver this kind of training. This is right up your alley. So could you please tell us more about the training you and your colleagues provide for employers?
Sure, Julie. Not only is it right up my alley, you're putting me out here on Front Street. So our business relations specialist team does offer no-cost disability etiquette and disability awareness trainings. We offer a variety of these training sessions, which can be customized for employers. Some of the topics in our disability awareness training sessions that can be addressed include windmills disability awareness, invisible disabilities, and the hiring and onboarding process. We also offer disability etiquette training, which can be customized for employers, so it's not second-hand information, or employers can view our on-demand version, which is available on our website. This training defines disability. It includes practical examples of respectful interactions with people with disabilities, and also addresses proper language usage. And Julie, I know you have some additional ideas for trainings that employers can consider.
Yes, another idea is to train all your employees on the right to reasonable accommodation. This training should address the right to reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities to participate in the hiring process, to access the work environment, to perform the essential functions of the job, and to enjoy the privileges of employment. Employees should also be made aware of how to request an accommodation. It's recommended that this type of training be delivered to new employees during onboarding and then to all employees on a regular basis. We did receive a question asking for communication samples that management can provide to their team regarding reasonable accommodations in their facility. And so I did include a resource from Jan in the Learner's Guide, which provides examples of accommodation policies, processes, forms, and training that employers can reference to create or revise their policies. It's also very helpful to train your supervisors on their role with reasonable accommodations. So in this kind of training, it's important to address how to recognize a request for an accommodation and then what steps to take when a supervisor receives a request, because often an employee will make this request to their supervisor and not someone in human resources. Supervisors should also be made aware of the confidentiality rules regarding medical information and reasonable accommodations, which includes advising supervisors on how you prefer they respond to questions they receive from employees about a coworker's reasonable accommodation. The EEOC guidance offers some ideas for responses, and we've included these in the Learner's Guide. These responses may be helpful for the discussion we had earlier regarding setting a precedent that all employees will want the same accommodation they see in the work environment.
Training is so very important, and OOD can help support employers' training needs. So please reach out to your local business relations specialist, especially if you're in the Southwest, for more information. You don't even need to figure out how to set your DVR for it. Julie, we received a question about a topic that we haven't discussed often, but it is very important to consider, and that is, how should an employer plan for handling emergencies with employees with disabilities?
Well, while some employers may be required under other laws to create evacuation plans, Title I does not require employers to establish these plans. However, it does require covered employers to ensure employees with disabilities have equal access to the benefits and privileges of employment. So if an employer has an emergency evacuation plan, they are required to include individuals with disabilities in this plan. And even in the absence of an emergency plan, employers may have to provide reasonable accommodations when they're needed for emergency situations. So employees with disabilities may or may not need assistance during an emergency at work. According to guidance from the EEOC, employers are permitted to ask employees to self-identify if they will require assistance because of a disability or a medical condition in the event of an evacuation at work. The guidance further explains 3 ways an employer may request this information. So the first is in the post-offer phase of pre-employment. An employer may ask all candidates whether they will need assistance during an emergency at work. Also, during employment, an employer may periodically ask all employees whether they need assistance during an emergency at work. And an employer may ask employees with known or obvious disabilities whether they will need assistance during an emergency when it's reasonable to believe assistance may be required. Of course, individuals who are asked about their need for assistance during an emergency at work should be notified of the confidentiality rules which apply to this kind of disclosure and should know this disclosure is not mandatory. Jan offers a resource on their website called Emergency Evacuation, and it addresses best practices for developing a plan, and it includes general ideas for accommodations by various categories. So I'll share a few of those with you now. One idea is to implement a buddy system for all employees to locate and help each other during an emergency. For employees with physical disabilities, you could purchase evacuation devices to assist with moving people down the stairs or across rough surfaces. For employees who are deaf or hard of hearing, you should supplement your audible alarms with visual or tactile alerts. For employees who are blind or have low vision, you could install tactile and audible signs and maps. For employees with intellectual disabilities, you could provide training and communications on these emergency procedures in alternative formats, such as through illustrations, color coding, and an audio format. And for employees with mental health disabilities, you could notify employees in advance of any upcoming training on your emergency evacuation procedures.
Thanks, Julie. Those are some good ideas to implement, and we've included the information for the JAN resource with more examples in the Learner's Guide. This next topic comes up from time to time, and it is a great one to address, Julie. The question is asking, can you ask a landlord for ADA services within the business?
Cynthia, there may be times an employer receives a request for a reasonable accommodation that involves making changes to the built environment it leases from a building owner. When this happens, the employer should review the lease agreement it has with the building owner to find out what changes the employer is allowed to make to the building. If the agreement states the employer has to obtain consent from the building owner first, then the employer should make a good faith effort to get permission to make the changes. According to guidance from the EEOC, if the building owner refuses to grant permission to the employer to make the changes, the employer may claim undue hardship. However, if this is the case, the employer should continue with the interactive process and collaborate with the individual to see if another accommodation exists that would not cause an undue hardship. One best practice for employers is to remember this obligation to provide reasonable accommodations when negotiating a lease agreement, so the responsibility for making changes to the built environment is addressed. Now, building owners may be required to make changes to the built environment for accessibility under Title II or Title III of the ADA, and so they should understand that a failure to do so could be considered interference with an employee's rights under Title I.
Thank you, Julie. I'm watching the time, so let's take one more break to see what questions we have. Okay. Can an employer suggest reasonable accommodation without the formal disclosure of a disability?
In general, the answer to that is no. It is the employee's role to disclose the disability and request it's their responsibility to disclose and request the accommodation. However, when a disability is known or it's obvious, and the employer can reasonably believe that an accommodation might be needed, then the employer would be permitted in that situation to ask. And an example of that would be an employee who is deaf is being asked to go to a conference out of state and is going to have to travel. And so it would be reasonable for the employer to ask the employee who's going to be performing a work task that they don't normally perform because they don't typically go to conferences if they would need a reasonable accommodation. So that is an example, and certainly the guidance from the EEOC addresses that in a little bit more detail as well, and we could also talk about that offline if that's helpful.
Great, thanks, Julie. All right, does the employer have to use the work opportunity tax credit to pay for reasonable accommodations?
Well, certainly you would want to talk with your tax professionals, but the tax credit, as far as we know, can be applied however you wish to apply it. And so if you want to reinvest it into a reasonable accommodation budget for future requests, if you want to use it towards building your disability inclusive efforts, we think those are great uses of that money. However, it's a tax credit. And again, as far as we know, you can use that in the way that you see best for your business, and just consult with your tax professionals.
All right, well, thank you for your questions. Julie, I know you have some final thoughts that you'd like to share before we close.
Yes, thank you, Cynthia, and thank you all for your questions. We'd like to thank you for attending the Employers ADA Handbook webinar series. All 5 sessions are available for on-demand access on our website, along with the learner's guides. We certainly hope the information in this series helps you with collaborating with individuals with disabilities to identify effective, reasonable accommodations and create inclusive work environments. We value your commitment to hiring and retaining individuals with disabilities and invite you to reach out to us at any time to talk further about the many no-cost services we have available for our employer partners. Cynthia, it has been great to co-present with you today, so thank you.